Yo, what's up? This is Mr. Nixon, and I wanted to go into some basics about the urinary system. Sometimes people struggle with this system on the test. They go into the test pretty confident, but then they get into the test and it's like, yo, I'm lost. I don't know what's going on. So here's one of the things you need to understand when you're learning about the urinary system in an anatomy and physiology class, and that is that the urinary system chapter, it may seem pretty long, but the vast majority of that chapter is going to spend most of its time in a structure called a nephron. So let's just talk about some real basics about the urinary system, and we'll make our way through this. First and foremost, the urinary system doesn't have a lot of organs. As a matter of fact, the only organs that are a part of the urinary system are the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. That's it. That's four things, dude. It's like not that big. It's not that deep. The only thing out of those four structures that are actually making urine are the kidneys. That's it. The ureters transport that freshly made urine to the urinary bladder. The bladder stores the urine, and then you release urine through your urethra to the outside environment. So that's it. I mean, that's the urinary system in a nutshell. It's not as intricate and detailed and lengthy as the digestive system. It's not full of all these different types of things like the cardiovascular system. It's just four organs that are making up the urinary system: the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and then the urethra. So you're going to spend most of your time in the kidney. Now, here's the kicker. Everything in the kidney is not making urine. As a matter of fact, in the kidney, you have the renal cortex, which is the outer area, and then you have the renal medulla, which is the inner area. If you think of the kidney and most soft organs in your body like a watermelon, you have the melon rind, which is that thick, hard outer area of the watermelon, and then you have the inner area with the pulp, which is the medulla. Well, in a kidney, the most functional areas of the kidney are not the medulla. The most functional areas of the kidney are actually out in the cortex, because out in the cortex, that's where you have these little microscopic tubes called nephrons. And you've got anywhere from 1 to 2 million of these things sitting outside in the cortex of a kidney. Now, this is where it gets really crazy. Basically, what's happening is your body is sending blood to your kidneys so that you can yank out a bunch of the water out of your blood, filter that, put the majority of it back into your blood, and let the residuals separate from it. And you take the residuals that you don't want to keep, and that becomes your urine. The rest of it you put back into the blood. So by the time the blood leaves the kidneys, it's had like 90 to 99% of all that stuff put back. So you personally never feel like you're not sitting there touching the back of your body saying, ooh, I feel something funny in my kidney. You don't, that's not you. You're not feeling things in your kidney going on. Now, if you are feeling something in your kidney, that's bad news. But on the average, you're not feeling what's going on there in the kidney, even though the kidney is miraculously pulling things out of the blood and saying, okay, we're going to sort things out. We're going to see what's in here. It's kind of like doing spring cleaning at your house. You go into a closet and there's this big box in the closet, and you're looking at this box saying to yourself, I don't know what's in this box. So you pull the box out of the closet. The box is still in your house. You never took the box out of your house. You took it out of the closet. You opened the box, and now you're emptying things out of the box. Some things you find out you want to keep. Some things you find out you want to throw away. The things that you want to throw away, you put into a trash bag and you send out to the curb in front of the house. Meanwhile, the things that you want to keep, you put into a smaller box and you put it in another place inside the house. You're doing the same thing with your kidneys. Your blood tends to have everything in it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You have things like good, like glucose and fructose and amino acids and sodium and potassium and magnesium and manganese and sodium chloride and you've got all these good things floating around in your blood. Then you have some bad, like lactic acid or urea. And then you might have some ugly. Some ugly might be some creatinine or something, some kind of constituent that was inside of some type of medication that you took before. And so you really have to get those things out of your system. Well, all of that was in the box. It was in your blood. So you pull that out at the nephron. And then it's your nephron's job to help you sort it out, to figure out what you want to keep and what you want to throw away. Now, the nephron is made up of all these cells that make up the lining of the tube. So they naturally kind of pick through things to say, hey, we want to keep this. Yeah, we want to throw this away. However, your body can intervene and say, you know what? I think we want to keep a little more of that today than usual. Or, nah, that's all right, bruh. Go ahead and throw a whole lot of that away. And we can influence it primarily by endocrine influence. So things like antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, hormones like that can have a direct effect. Hormones like parathyroid hormone or calcitonin, those hormones can have an effect on the kidneys as well, to help you determine on how much calcium you're going to keep and how much calcium you're going to throw away, how much water you're going to keep and how much water you're going to throw away, how much sodium you're going to keep and how much sodium you're going to throw away. Those hormones can have that effect as well. When you go into learning about the urinary system, one of the things that you have absolutely positively have to remember is that the nephron runs things. If you take out your nephrons, you have essentially taken out the kidney. I know. When you get into the urinary system, you start studying the kidneys and you look at them from an anatomical standpoint. You're looking at it just flat anatomy. There are a ton of structures that you have to learn when you're looking at the kidneys, because you're learning the kidneys. There's the renal artery, the renal vein. Then you got all these other arteries and veins, segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, interlobular arteries, then the afferent and efferent arterioles, the glomerulus, the peritubular capillaries. You've got the nephron and the parts of the nephron. You have the collecting ducts and the collecting tubules. You have the minor calyx, the major calyx. You've got the renal pelvis, the renal sinus. And then you have the matching veins. You have the renal cortex and the renal medulla. You have the capsule of the kidney. You have all these structures, and you're like, oh man, there's all these anatomical structures. Oh no. Most of those anatomical structures that I named have nothing to do with the production of urine. Zero, zilch. Now, several of those structures, like the minor and major calyx and the collecting ducts and collecting tubules, the renal pelvis, the renal sinus, the ureter, which I didn't mention before, those structures, they are responsible for transporting urine. They're not responsible for making urine. They just transport it. They're transporting the urine that your nephrons just successfully created and getting it out of the house, out to the curb. So those guys don't make urine. The only ones that are involved in making urine are the nephrons. And the nephrons are basically made up of two structures. The nephron is made up of the renal cortex, not the renal cortex, I'm sorry, the renal capsule and the renal tubule. So you have the renal capsule and then you have the renal tubule. And depending on what textbook you have, they might have different names for them. Typically, renal tubule is generally the same thing that's used over and over again. Renal capsule, they play with that one a little bit, but usually it's the renal capsule. So the renal capsule is responsible for one part of the urine making process, and then the renal tubule is responsible for another part of the urine making process. And with the renal capsule, that is the one that's responsible for filtration. The renal tubule is responsible for reabsorption and secretion. Now, this is where things get a little tricky, and you got to be careful with this because it's very simple. And I found that sometimes simple things can get really complex really quick. And this is what I mean. So filtration, if you did well understanding the capillaries in the chapter on blood vessels, then you are good to go. if you did not understand the chapter on blood vessels, then this could hurt. So let me slow down and step back for a minute. In the blood vessel chapter, it talked about capillaries and how important it is to understand how things get in and out of capillaries. And you learn that there's hydrostatic pressure or capillary hydrostatic pressure, and then there's colloid osmotic pressure. And that hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that's forcing things out of a capillary, while colloid osmotic pressure is what's actually pulling things back in to the capillary. This is important to understand with filtration, because essentially what happens is you have an arteriole that leaves an artery inside the kidneys. Like we're inside the kidney, we're actually in the cortex of the kidney. There's an artery going by, and then there's this arteriole that comes out of it. And arteriole, and remember, an arteriole is important to remember, because an arteriole there's always a capillary after an arteriole. So the arteriole comes out, and then there's this big ball of capillaries that's inside the renal capsule. And inside this renal capsule, this ball of capillaries is known as a glomerulus. And the glomerulus is a very specialized group of capillaries. It's not like a normal group of capillaries. These capillaries have holes in them that are a little larger than the average capillary. And so what winds up happening is that hydrostatic pressure forces a large amount of fluid in your blood to come out and into the capsular space. Osmotic pressure is extremely important here, because osmotic pressure is going to cause a lot of that fluid to try to go back into the capillary, which is important. So a lot of that fluid comes out of the blood, it goes into the capsule. A lot of that fluid is going to try to go back into the capillary. The rest of the fluid that does not go back into the capillaries goes straight into the renal tubule. So first the renal capsule, then the renal tubule. It's the job of the renal tubule to help decide what of all that fluid are we going to keep and what of all that fluid we're going to throw away. The cool thing is, remember that glomerulus, that ball of capillaries that was inside the renal capsule? Well, the blood that's remaining in that glomerulus is going to leave, and instead of going into a venule, it goes into another arteriole. This is the only place in the body where we're going to talk about this in anatomy and physiology too. So the blood leaves the capillaries and goes into another arteriole, and then goes into a second capillary bed known as the peritubular capillaries. Peri meaning around, tubular, the tube. The peritubular capillaries are capillaries that wrap around the renal tubules. So as all that fluid travels through the renal tubules and it's sitting there selecting, saying, this is what we're going to keep and this is what we're going to throw away, whatever it decides that it's going to keep comes out of the tubules, goes into the peritubular capillaries. Those capillaries then drain into venules. Those venules drain into veins, and then they drain out of the kidneys and back into your renal vein. And by doing that, the blood leaves the kidneys clean. You don't feel any of that because that is happening on a micro level. So let's go back to the nephron. Hydrostatic pressure in the glomerulus forces fluids out of the glomerulus, out of those capillaries into the capsular space. Osmotic pressure tries to bring it back into the glomerulus, but most of that fluid is going to go right into the renal tubules, and the renal tubules are going to actually reabsorb most of that and put it back in the blood anyway. Now, I know you're thinking, well, dude, if most of it's going to go back into the blood anyway, then why'd you take so much out? Well, that's because we don't have at the level of a blood vessel, we don't have an effective way of pulling out just the waste products and leaving everything else in. That actually has to happen at the renal tubule, where we can slow things down enough and bring it down to a microscopic level so that the cells can individually pump things in and out. because everything is dissolved in the blood plasma when it's in the blood. Like glucose and lactic acid are both occupying the same space at the same time. Guess what? We can't pull one out without pulling the other out. That's like me saying, hey, can I borrow a couple of cups of sugar? I want to make some lemonade. And so I make some Kool-Aid. And so I take a Kool-Aid packet, dump it in some water, take your cups of sugar, dump it in some water, mix it up, say, this is going to be good. Stick it in the fridge, pull it out cold, pour me a cup. You come knock on the door talking about, hey, Mr. Nixon, I hate to do this to you, but I kind of need a cup of that sugar back. I'm going to look at you like, sorry, dude, there's nothing I can do. I'd love to give you this cup of sugar back, but I poured the sugar into a solvent. So I've poured your solutes into my solvent. Now I have a solution. It's extremely difficult for me to pull that sugar out of that solution because it's dissolved in it. So what winds up happening is in your body, you got to remember that your blood is made out of plasma and formed elements. Over half of this thing is plasma. 92% of plasma is water. You've got all these things dissolved, all these solvents dissolved in this all these solutes, excuse me. You have all these solutes dissolved in this solvent, which is turned into a solution, which is plasma. I can't just reach in the plasma and pull out what I want. I have to send it through a process so that it can be pulled out on a microscopic level. And that's where we've gone with this. So when you're studying the nephron, look at the different parts. You have the renal capsule. Some people refer to it as the renal corpuscle. And you have the Bowman's capsule, which is around it. And then inside of it, you have this ball of blood vessels known as the glomerulus. It's a big ball of capillaries. And so you have this ball of capillaries, and through hydrostatic pressure, you force things out of the capillaries and into the capsular space. Those fluids now have to travel through the renal tubule, which is made up of the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. And as it goes through each segment, we can actually decide what we want to keep and what we want to throw away. In the proximal convoluted tubule, the vast majority of nutrients that we pulled out, we actually want to keep. And so what it does is it helps to reabsorb those nutrients. In the loop of Henle, there's a lot of water concentration being analyzed and being adjusted. If I don't need a lot of water because I've been drinking a lot of water, then my loop of Henle will allow me to be able to utilize that water to dilute the urine on its way through. If my body says, sorry, Julian, you've not been drinking enough water, you kind of dehydrated, then I'm going to keep a lot of that water in the body, and I'm not going to use it to dilute the urine. That's why your urine looks so dark when you first wake up in the morning and you use the bathroom, because you've been asleep. You haven't been drinking water. So your body's been, every hour, it's been making new urine constantly. But while you've been making new urine every hour while you've been asleep, you've not been drinking water. So therefore your urine looks a little concentrated. That's okay when you first wake up. But if it's 2 in the afternoon and your urine is like Clemson orange, bruh, you got to get some water in your diet. Your urine is not diluted enough. You're actually dehydrated. So then this fluid, and we don't call it urine while it's in the renal tubules. We actually call it filtrate while it's there. We don't call it urine until it leaves the nephrons, if you're going to be real picky about it. But that filtrate then goes up into the distal convoluted tubule, and the distal convoluted tubule, it helps to balance out certain electrolytes. It helps to balance out certain drugs and solutes that we couldn't add in from the beginning of the process. Things that you find in your Tylenol or whatever that you got to throw away, we add that into the filtrate at the distal convoluted tubule. And then it goes into the collecting tubule and then into the collecting duct. And when it gets into the collecting duct, this is kind of our last chance that we have to adjust the concentration of urine. At the collecting duct, this is our last opportunity to say, do we want to use this much water or do we not want to use this much water? And when you're using water to move urine out of the kidneys, think of it kind of like, you know, using water to flush a toilet. So we've got the water. We say, hey, we want to keep a lot of the water, then we'll reabsorb the water. If we don't want to keep the water, then we'll secrete the water, and that water will be added to the filtrate and the final concentration, which will ultimately become urine. So we'll talk a little more in the future about the urinary system. That's just a very brief overview of a whole bunch of important things. If you're watching this and you say, hey, how do I get the most out of this video? You want to definitely go back and write down the key points or the key structures that I was naming. You'll find them in your textbook as usually bold type words, and look and learn about the intricate way that they are detailed. We'll have another video coming up soon that'll get into more detail on the nephron itself. Talk to you guys soon.